Welcome back, everyone, to the eCoreAcademy e-learning platform today. My name is AJay Raj, back with yet another anatomy and physiology video for you guys. And today's lesson topic is all about the layers of the epidermis in our anatomy and physiology course. Now, before we get into today's topic, please make sure you guys smash that subscribe button down below, hit that like button on this video, as well as smashing that bell to get notified on any of our channel's latest posts at eCoreAcademy. And before we get into this whole specific topic of the layers of the epidermis, I want you guys to be aware that you guys should visit the previous videos that I've made in anatomy and physiology on the integumentary system before we get into today's layers of the epidermis, because there are some specific topics and specific points that you might not understand if you don't watch those videos previously. So you guys should watch the video about the layers of the skin, the types of skin, and the integumentary system, and the entire anatomy and physiology introduction. Because I go into depth and I mention a lot of topics that are mentioned here. But I will, of course, try my best for you who don't have the time to go back and view those videos. I will try my best to explain each and every topic mentioned to the fullest of my ability so that you guys can understand. So today's layers of the epidermis topic is all about discovering what are the different layers of the epidermis and what are each of their functions. So if you go back and see my layers of the skin, layers of the skin video, just to recap off of it, there's three main layers of the skin, and those are the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. The epidermis being the most exterior part of the skin, the most exterior layer of the skin, and hypodermis being the innermost layer of the skin. Now, we're talking about the layers of the epidermis. Now, you might be confused because I mentioned layer of the skin and layers of the epidermis. Well, it's two completely different parts. This is a subset of the layers of the skin. So we're taking a specific layer of the skin and we're breaking it down into 5 separate parts. And that's what we're going over, the 5 different layers of the epidermis. All right, let's get right into it. The very first layer that we have here is the stratum basale, and it's the deepest epidermal layer. Epidermal meaning of the epidermis. And it's known as the growing layer of the skin, and it's the base of the outermost part of the skin, which is the epidermis. It's known as the growing layer of the skin because this is where the hair follicles, with basically your hair, body hair, is all matured, and the hair follicle actually breaches this part of the epidermis as it then extracts and breaches through your pores on the exterior of your skin. So that's why it's known as the growing layer of the skin, and a lot of physiological structure and materials and minerals are all produced in this very part of the epidermis. And the stratum basale is attached by hemidesmosomes, which are special disc-shaped proteins. And what they basically do is these special disc-shaped proteins, the hemidesmosomes, they're attached to the basement membrane, which is a network of protein fibers that separate the epidermis from the dermis. Now, if you don't already know, the dermis is below the epidermis in the skin, and since those two skin layers are on top of each other, you need a fine line to separate those two layers of the skin, and the stratum basale is known for that. And what it does is these hemidesmosomes, which are these proteins, they basically form the basement membrane. That's the bottommost part of the epidermis, and what they do is they basically section off the dermis from the epidermis, and they basically breach off all connections except for specific and special tubules that we'll get into later. And these network of protein fibers separate the epidermis from the superficial or below dermis layer. And this is where the production occurs in the stratum basale, and it includes immunizing cells. So what I mean by the production is basically throughout the epidermis, you have to have some sort of flow of minerals, proteins, and of course you have to have some sort of blood flow and process regulation throughout the entire layer of the epidermis. And basically what that production means is that in the stratum basale, you have a lot of components like immunizing cells, which are your cells that help you with your immunization and your immune system, and plenty of other cells that help with your skin coloration, your melanin, and other protection sequences, as well as what keeps your epidermis healthy and existent. And as you can see here, I'm going to use my trusty e-pen. I'm going to try and incorporate this concept so it's much more interactive with you guys, and so we can be on the same page while I'm instructing. So this stratum basale is right here, as you can see in yellow, the stratum basale right here. And basically what the stratum basale consists of is this little section here. This is a ridge of a bunch of skin tissue right here. I'm separating that. And basically right here, this little yellow blob that I'm highlighting, that's basically where the hemidesmosomes are layered up and stacked up. And then this is where the tissue and the immunizing cells are included in, and that can include your melanosomes, and keratinocytes. So melanosomes is the most important part, as well as keratinocytes. And keratinocytes and melanosomes, they both help with immunizing effects, as melanosomes help with the melanin production and your skin coloration, and keratinocytes help with your hair follicle and hair growth. All right, let's move on to the next slide. And this is basically an extension. This is our part 2 of our stratum basale. The stratum basale is also known as the stratum germinativum, which is basically another name for the stratum basale because of the type of tissue that's involved. So it's basically the stratum basale is where the epidermal ridges make contact with the dermis. So the epidermal ridges are basically what are shown here. And epidermal ridges are basically where the breaching point between the epidermis and the dermis are, and that's the only part where the epidermis and the dermis make contact with each other. So I'm just gonna underline that here, stratum germinativum. It's basically where the epidermal ridges make contact with the dermis, and that's basically the only place where contact is made. And then if you look at dermal papillae, it's where these epidermal ridges, the only place where contact between the epidermis and the dermis make contact, it's the only place where these epidermal ridges come into contact. So this is the point where they come into contact with the rest of the dermis, and that's very important. Because what dermal papillae does is it allows the exchanging of nutrients between the dermis and the epidermis. Because what blood does and red blood cells do is it transports all these minerals, these oxygen. So I'll just write that here. Blood equals oxygen and proteins. And that is essential for any sort of tissue existing in the body. But because there are no blood vessels in the epidermis, there is no constant blood flow or production of blood indirectly with the epidermis. So that means it's heavily dependent on this dermal papillae. And what the dermal papillae basically does is, right here, it basically expunges all that material right here through this point here, and it expunges all this material, including blood, and other proteins and minerals, and of course oxygen, and it helps produce that, expunge that, and place that directly into the epidermis. And that's very important for the epidermis, for it to actually exist and for it to actually survive. And this is the epidermal ridges, and this is where this piece, as you can see here, this little, I'm going to trace this out, the edge of this dermal papillae will actually make contact with this epidermal ridge. And this epidermal ridge is in the dermis, and this dermal papillae is in both the epidermis and the dermis. On to the next slide. So this is our stratum spinosum. This is the second most bottom layer of the epidermis, and it consists of keratinocytes, which are always at least 10 cells deep. So what keratinocytes are is basically they are cells that help with hair growth, and they're also immunizing cells that help with blockage in the pores, and they help with your overall immune system. And it's about 10 cells deep with this keratinocyte. So you can tell that 10 cells on a microscopic level, that's very, very, very small. And in general, the epidermis is extremely small as well. And it consists of the stratum spinosum consists of many maturing cells, as it is also a focal point for cell division, how cells are produced. So I'm going to just recap. It consists of keratinocytes right here, which basically go about 10 cells deep. So keratinocytes, which are always at least 10 cells deep. And that's important to know because it always fluctuates with the whole process of how cells are expunged and basically transferred through these different cells of the epidermis, and it consists of many maturing cells. This layer of the epidermis, this stratum spinosum, and it's a focal point for cell division. That's what I mean by maturing cells, and that's how cells are produced. So cells are produced through cell division, and that's its whole entire topic that I will get into later. And basically, that's how cells are produced in the epidermis. That's a production part, and it includes melanosomes, dendritic cells, as well as I said before, keratinocytes. And as you can see here, the stratum spinosum is right here. And this is all relative. This diagram shows the exact size representation accurately. So I'm just going to section this off here for the stratum spinosum. And as you can see, the stratum spinosum is actually quite large here. And it's actually not the largest layer. The stratum corneum is, but we'll get into that on our last layer. It's the outermost layer. But the stratum spinosum, as you can see here, it has very blocky items here. And that's basically active cells. And these cells help produce other cells. And this is where cell production is very prominent. So I'm just going to say here, cell production. That's basically the main function of the stratum spinosum. No transformation is happening yet, but cell production is very key here. Cell production. Yep. And then for our third deepest layer, it's the stratum granulosum, and it's known as the layer of transformation. So it's right outside of the stratum spinosum, and it has to do with the transformation process, which is a place when matured cells, which come from the dermis, begin to flatten in shape and disintegrate. So we're just going to recap. So the stratum basale is basically where these cells are maturing and they're producing each other. They're basically maturing from the dermis. So what happens is all of these minerals in these cells are coming from the dermis, these immunizing cells. Then they're in the stratum basale, they're starting to mature. Then in the stratum spinosum, they're starting to reproduce and become a lot more plethora here. But since we have to recap that the epidermis is mostly made up of dead skin. So after all that production is done, there's going to have to be a part where everything starts to slow down and go backwards, where everything starts to get destroyed and starts to build up into dead layers of skin cells. And this transformation process actually starts here. It's when matured cells from the dermis begin to flatten in shape, flatten in shape and disintegrate. So that's part of the transformation process from basically an active cell to a dead cell in the epidermis. And keratinization also occurs here, not just the transformation process. Keratinization begins when keratin develops a wall at the top of this layer. And that's one of the only cells in this layer that actually doesn't go through that transformation process. However, less matured keratinocytes, not all keratinocytes actually survive this transformation process. Only a certain type or a certain amount. And these less matured ones actually die, as well as all other cells begin that dying process and that transformation process in which they lose their nuclei and die. So the nuclei is basically the center of a cell. In any cell, it doesn't matter what type, it can be a melanosome, a keratinocyte, and what happens is, say for example, this circle is a cell, right? This is the nucleus, this is the center part. It's the largest part of the largest organelle of the cell, and what happens there is it's a command center of the cell. It's almost like a human losing their brain. So a nucleus is gone from the cell, it loses its command center, and basically it becomes a dead cell like this. Nothing inside, and all of its organelles also begin to disintegrate. And as you can see here, the stratum granulosum is actually also very small because it's a very small part of this transformation process right here. Excluding the white parts, that's a stratum lucidum, which is our next layer. And yeah, basically this top layer here that you can see here that I'm sketching out, that's what the keratinocyte layer, and everything below it will actually just die out and begin the transformation process in which they be turned into dead skin cells, which basically layer up the outermost parts of our epidermis. Now we have our stratum lucidum, which is the fourth layer of the epidermis, which is only found in thick skin. So that's very important to know. The stratum lucidum is not it's not existent in all types of skin. So it's only specially found in thick skin. And I mentioned in my other previous video types of skin. I suggest you look at all of my previous integumentary system videos, but specifically for thick skin, I had included it in my types of skin video for the integumentary system in anatomy and physiology. And thick skin is basically hairless skin found on the soles of the feet and the palms of the hand. So that's the only places where thick skin is actually found. And this stratum lucidum just basically consists of a thin translucent band which obtains heavy amounts of fatty tissue. So the stratum lucidum doesn't necessarily have a function, except that it is a breaching point in thick skin, and it basically helps with touch. It helps with excessive touch, which in this case it has centroses, which are stands of sensory receptors that's only found in thick skin, because thick skin is actually your most sensitive part of your skin. And these centroses actually help with heightened sensory through your sensory receptors. And your sensory receptors are what feel, any touch, any abrasion, any heat, cold, sensitivity all out throughout the skin. So the stratum lucidum doesn't necessarily have a function. It's just there for excess sensitivity, and only in thick skin, which is basically only 5% of the body. 95% of the body is thin skin, which is the other type of skin. And I'm just going to recap here the stratum lucidum right here. I'm circling it. It's this white piece here, and this white just basically represents fat, which I'm indicating with this yellow. So it's basically just fat, and it includes these centroses, which are basically like little strands that I'm drawing here, little strands that originate from actual sensory receptor that are found in the dermis. So they basically help pretend that these are sensory receptors. I'm just going to write that here, receptors. And then these receptors basically go up through these centroses, and what happens is they go out to the external part of the skin, and they basically give a neurological command to these sensory receptors that are later transmitted to the central nervous system in the brain. And we'll also get into all of this later on, these specific items that I'm including in skin. But there's many different systems that I will go across, such as the central nervous system and the central immune system. All right, and finally, for our last layer of this epidermis, we have the stratum corneum. And as I said before, it's the outermost layer of the skin, and it's compacted of dead cells. Now, remember how I mentioned that transformation process, right? Where I talked about the stratum granulosum being the starting of this transformation process. This is basically end part. This is where all the cells are completely dead, and this is basically just where these dead cells layer up, and they also recycle. They have recycling properties, and that's the function, just recycling properties. This layer consists of all cells with the disintegrated organelles, which are basically just dead cells, and they're coming from layers below, in which form a layer that is 20 cells thick. So as you can see here in our stratum corneum, this is our very thickest layer right here. It's 20 cells thick. I know that might sound like a lot, but it's still a very small amount. But just in relation to these other layers, it's much larger. And these cells would include many immunizing cells and general skin cells, and they include melanocytes, melanosomes, keratinocytes, fibroprotein, and many more. And that's just cells in general. So it doesn't have to be a specific type of cell, and just not blood cells. That's the only type of cell that's not included. So these dead cells like melanocytes and melanosomes, which help with skin pigmentation, keratinocytes, which helps with hair growth, and other fibroproteins that help with tissue quality, they all just basically stack up in a dead graveyard. It's just your graveyard right here. And it utilizes blockages, which are basically formed through this dead skin cells to basically patch up your pores, because it's your outermost layer of your skin, and that's where the pores are. The pores are where your hair basically breaches through your skin. That's those little holes on your skin. And what happens is this layer actually forms a sort of blockage type method, which is use its dead skin cells to actually block off these pores from any form of bacteria, viruses, or just harmful items in general. And this process takes 2 to 4 weeks, and I'm referring to the recycling property process. And what I mean by taking 2 to 4 weeks is that basically all of those dead skin cells will actually eventually peel off of you within 2 to 4 weeks, and a full new set of dead skin cell layers will be formed within that time. Not to say that after 2 to 4 weeks it all stays, and then that one day that your 4 week time period ends, it all falls off. No, it's very gradual and minute by minute, certain amount is falling off, and it depends on what activity you might be doing. If you're getting excessively burned by the sun, or if you just have scratching, that also causes it to come off very quickly. Alright guys, so that'll be it for today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed. It was the layers of our epidermis by, of course, me, AJay Raj. And this has been eCoreAcademy, our e-learning platform. Please make sure to like and subscribe down below. Hit that bell to get notified on any of our channel's latest posts. Visit our website at our link at eCoreAcademy.org. Email us at gmail@ecoreacademy@gmail.com if you have any questions or if you want to reach us. And also about our website here. In our website, we have many more perks than just our YouTube channel. We have all of our videos embedded, so we have our videos, and then we have worksheets here that go along with each and every video, and as well as notes that go along with them directly. And finally, we have integrated quizzes, so it gives you the full learning experience just as you would in any high-quality online course or even just school. Integrated quizzes. Alright guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and please visit all of our other socials at Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's been AJ, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.